Well, welcome all to this episode of the Mountaineers web series about discovering the best of Europe on foot. I'm Doug Canfield, and we are happy to have two authors with us this evening. Beth Jacino is the author of Walking to the End of the World, 1,000 Miles on the Camino de Santiago. And Cassandra Overby is the author of Explore Europe on Foot, Your Complete Guide to Planning a Cultural Hiking Adventure. Without knowing each other before writing their books, Cassandra and Beth's travels and experiences in Europe brought them largely to a similar understanding, which is that walking through Europe is fun and fulfilling way to experience other cultures, and that anyone can share this wonderful, rich mode of travel, whether or not you think of yourself as athletic. Beth is a self-professed non-athlete and has written a wonderful narrative story that lets readers see and feel through her eyes what walking on the famous Camino de Santiago is like. Cassandra's book is an actual guidebook that lays out all the information you need to plan your own Europe by foot vacation and offers specific travel details for 15 trails that are among her favorites. The slow travel that Beth and Cassandra will tell you about doesn't require sleeping on the ground or skipping any served meals, but this is the sort of travel that avoids the hot scramble to check off as many crowded tourist attractions as possible. And it's instead allows you to become immersed in another culture, the people, the land, the scents, and much more. Beth Jacino is an active member of the American Pilgrims of the Camino de Santiago, and offers workshops and talks about the way of St. James as often as anyone will let her. She has returned to the Camino twice. You can find photos and read much more about her Camino obsession at CaminoTimes2.com. That's CaminoTimestwo.com. When she's not carrying a backpack across Europe, Beth is a writer, editor, and publishing consultant in Seattle. Find out more about Beth's day job at bethjacino.com. Cassandra Overby is a freelance travel and outdoors writer who loves combining her enthusiasm for foreign travel and hiking by encouraging people to explore the world on foot and helping them do it. To read more of Cassandra's active travel writing and to see the magazines she regularly contributes to, visit CassandraOverby.com. Learn more about her travel brand, Explore on Foot, at explore-on-foot.com. This evening, we are fortunate to have two co-sponsors helping make this event happen. These partners are Women on Adventures and Adventure Mamas Initiative. Women on Adventures helps women expand their comfort zone by having fun, making new friends, and adventuring in order to make real and lasting change in their lives. Learn more about Women on Adventures at womenonadventures.com. Adventure Mamas Initiative strives to support women's wellness by facilitating adventure, building community, and providing educational resources. Explore further by visiting them at adventuremamas.org. And finally, a shout out to Hiking for Her, which offers a bounty of free how-to-hike advice and information geared toward women hikers. Hiking for Her is part hiking blog, part archive of hiking knowledge. Check out their resources at hiking-for-her.com. That's hikingforher.com with hyphens in between the words. This presentation will run about 30 minutes, followed by a question and answer period. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentation in the question box that you can see on the right side of your screen. So let's get started, and I'm going to hand this over to Beth and Cassandra. Welcome, ladies.
Thanks so much, Doug. And thanks to Mountaineers Books, Women on Adventure, and Adventure Mama for hosting this event. I'm Beth Jacino. I am the author of Walking to the End of the World, 1,000 Miles on the Camino de Santiago. And my story begins about 7 years ago. My husband Eric and I were in our 30s, in the midstream of our careers and our marriage. We lived in Seattle, which I consider to be the best corner of the world. And we had meaningful jobs and good friends and overall a great life. But at the same time, nothing felt real. I had just started running my own consulting business, and it already felt like I was spinning my wheels, a slave to 4 separate email accounts, multicolor coded calendars, and all of the blinking, beeping apps on my phone. I couldn't get from my apartment to my car without checking in with social media. But at the end of a day or a month or a year, I couldn't point to anything that seemed like it mattered. Eric was in a similar boat, and we agreed that we needed an adventure. We wanted something epic and grand. I was drawn to the idea of long distance hiking, the kind of challenge that takes you outside for months and slows life down to a human pace and that doesn't require a smartphone. But at the same time, like Doug said, I'm not a get out in nature kind of person. I actually think that yoga is an extreme sport. I didn't own a sleeping bag when we started talking about this, which is the nice way of saying that I really don't camp. So when I discovered the long distance trails of Europe, and specifically the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, I knew that I had found my kind of real.
Hi, my name is Cassandra Overby, and I'm the author of Explore Europe on Foot. Like Beth, I stumbled on the long distance trails of Europe because of burnout, but my burnout was of a different kind, the traveling kind. I spent most of my 20s as a nomad, either working multiple jobs to save up for a trip or on a trip. During that time, I lived in Germany and Austria for 14 months, but my wanderlust wasn't limited to Europe. Given the chance, I went anywhere and everywhere. Northern Africa, Haiti. In 2010, I sold most everything I had and launched out on what I thought would be my biggest adventure yet, a trip around the world. But after 3 months in Guatemala, my first stop of the trip, I packed my bags and I headed home. At first, I couldn't explain it to anyone else, let alone myself. The longer I thought about it, the more it seemed that my life as a traveler was over. I no longer found fulfillment in sightseeing. I was tired of long lines, loud tourists, bus exhaust, and expensive attractions. And I was fed up with how inauthentic and global, not local, international travel had become. It seemed like no matter where I was, it was American pop music that played on the radio and French fries that were the side dish of choice. For 5 whole years, I took a hiatus from any significant travel. But in 2015, I got back on the horse, joining Mac, a man I had recently started dating and would end up marrying, on his big dream, a grand tour of Europe. This time, I tried to do things differently. To some degree, that meant doing something I love to do at home, hike. Mac and I started taking long walks, sometimes an afternoon, sometimes a whole day, wherever we were. We soon graduated to multi-day trips where we walked from hut to hut or village to village. It didn't take long before I realized that this just wasn't fun. I'd actually stumbled on a better and more authentic way to travel. One that led to more only tourists around, Rick Steves' eat your heart out moments than I'd ever had with traditional tourism. I called it exploring on foot, this new kind of travel, and I was hooked. And that brings us to you. Beth and I aren't just convinced that taking an epic European walk was revolutionary for us. We're confident that it will revolutionize your life too. Here's why. First of all, when you take an epic walk, you find your way to the very best small towns. This is really important because if you want to truly experience a foreign culture, the best place to look is not a city or a museum. It's a small town, a rural outpost, where people primarily speak the local language, cook local food, listen to local music, and have real communities with a flavor all their own. Those towns are easy to find when you're walking because long trails, those that go village to village or hut to hut, are typically divided into daily stages that end where you can find accommodation, food, and interesting things to do. Hiking into one of those villages, like Rottenbuch, Germany, is an amazing way to drop in on a culture and see it for what it really is and how it really functions. One of my favorite Samantha Brown travel quotes sums it up. Authentic travel is never in the must-sees, always in the mundane. When you're on foot, you're much more accessible to local people, so it's easier to see real local life. You learn about when people get up, what they do for work, how they spend their free time, when they go to bed, and what they believe. And like with this Maypole Festival, you learn what they celebrate. To locals, those details are pretty mundane, but to a traveler, they're magical. When you take an epic walk, you have historical wonders like these ruins in Greece all to yourself. As amazing as they are, these spots don't get visited as often because they're not as convenient to get to or are downright inaccessible by car or coach. You can explore castles that are hundreds of years old and climb down into bunkers like this one from World War II that I found on France's GR-34. When you're on foot, you don't need to beat the crowds to these places. Most of the time, you have them all to yourself. Another bonus, you can experience these gems on your own time, whether that means spending an hour in contemplation or giving them a quick nod of appreciation before moving on. Besides coming across the best small towns and most interesting sights when you're hiking, you also gain a far greater appreciation for the land you're passing through. This is something you just can't experience when you drive along a road or stay inside air-conditioned museums. To really appreciate the landscape, you need to get out in nature and let it engage all of your senses. See its richness of detail, touch, hear, smell, and even taste it. Nature is a great teacher, and Iceland is a good example. You can read that Iceland is one of the most volcanically active landscapes in the world, but it takes on new meaning when you're surrounded by hissing and boiling sulfurous mud. When you take an epic walk, you won't just soak in nature. Nature will revolutionize your state of mind, giving you the restorative experience that vacation is meant to be. That's really important because, as Beth talked about earlier, modern life can be really complicated. Between electronic screens and conflicting schedules, it can feel like you're always on, always connected, and always busy. Being on trail makes it easy to unplug and get away from all of that, from news alerts, Facebook notifications, and work emails. I always sleep better when I'm off the grid, and I know you will too. It's almost hard to believe, but when you explore on foot, you visit more interesting towns, experience culture more vividly, see undiscovered sights, gain a better appreciation for the landscape, and have the restorative experience that vacation is meant to be, all for less money than you would spend on traditional tourism. One of the reasons is that your main activity each day is walking, not purchasing admission into expensive attractions, so you don't have a lot of costs beyond gear, food, and accommodations. Gear doesn't have to cost you a ton. Comfy clothes, a good backpack, and sturdy shoes will get you where you need to go. Food and accommodations in rural areas cost less than they do in metropolitan areas. And because the cost of living in Europe can be significantly cheaper than in the United States, for example, an average double room will cost you $50 a night, and 2 people can eat a good dinner with wine for $25 to $50, a walking holiday can be downright affordable. If you walk in Eastern rather than Western Europe, it can actually be cheap. And when your money goes further, you can hit the trail most often. All of that sounds pretty amazing, right? I'm going to tell you something else that you're going to love. Taking an epic walk in Europe isn't just an incredible experience, it's also easy to do. And that's because Europe has a variety of things, from impressive public transportation to plenty of on-trail accommodations and cafes, to a variety of piecemeal services like luggage transfer that make taking a long walk a breeze. Public transportation is key because it means most trailheads are easily accessible by bus, train, and sometimes even funicular. Public transportation is also great because it can help you shorten the daily stages of your walks. If you love a trail that has 8-hour daily stages, but you'd really like to walk for only 4, you can usually take a taxi, post bus, or gondola for a section to shorten things up. One of the things I really love about Europe is that thanks to the variety of on-trail accommodations, you can look forward to sleeping in a real bed each night. There's so much to choose from and experience. Some of the accommodations are mountain huts. Others, like this one in England, are cozy bed and breakfasts where you'll be served tea each afternoon on the lawn. Depending on your trail, you can even stay in castles. How cool is that? It's not just accommodations that you'll find on trail. Most routes also feature a selection of cafes, pubs, and restaurants, which means that you can enjoy a hot meal and a cold beverage at lunchtime instead of a squish sandwich. Beyond amazing trails, great public transportation, and a variety of accommodations and cafes, Europe also has an abundance of services to support walkers and make your trip easier. Of course, if you want to do everything yourself, you can. But if you'd like some help from one-off services like having your luggage transported from one spot to the next so you can walk with just a day pack, to having the trail narrated by a guide on a bona fide walking tour like this one I did in Iceland, There are lots of companies that would love to assist you and to make your walk an even more enjoyable experience. There's so much to look forward to on trail in Europe. In part, that's because there are so many different kinds of epic walks to experience, each with a flavor all their own. One of those is a pilgrimage, which Beth will tell you all about.
As you're probably already figuring out, when it comes to epic walks in Europe, you've got a lot of options. Different landscapes, different lengths, different cultures. But as far as long-distance walking goes, the Way of St. James, more commonly known as the Camino de Santiago, is probably the most famous trail network in Europe. More than 300,000 people from around the world arrived in Santiago de Compostela last year and received their Compostela certificates, which a person can earn by walking, biking, or riding a horse for at least the final 100 kilometers to the city. But the Camino is a lot longer than a 100-kilometer walk. In fact, I've spent more than 100 days exploring it, and I'm nowhere near done. When I say that, it surprises the people who think that the Camino is a single end-to-end trail. Most of the stories in the media and the pilgrim narratives, including that popular movie with Martin Sheen called The Way, show only the part of the pilgrimage trails that start in the French town of Saint John Pied Port, just on the pass of the Pyrenees. But St. John is, by many accounts, just the midpoint of the trail, not the beginning. When the Camino is described in the media as a 500-mile or an 800-kilometer trail, they're actually describing a section of a much larger network. This is the Camino Francés that stretches across the interior of Spain. The complete Way of St. James stretches back into France, down into Portugal, and to every corner of Spain. The subtrails and variants extend all the way from Denmark to Italy. During my time on the Camino, I met people who walked or biked from their homes in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland. Today, the United Nations recognizes 4 French trails and 5 of the Spanish routes as World Heritage Sites, which means they still reflect the original routes that the Christians of the 10th and 11th centuries took on journeys of prayer or penance to Santiago, to visit the remains of Jesus's disciple, St. James, which had reportedly been miraculously discovered in the mid-900s. When Eric and I walked, we discovered that today's modern routes are not explicitly religious, but they are still tied deeply to the history and heritage. We passed through grand cathedrals and toured medieval villages full of history, both quirky and sacred. When it came time for Eric and I to choose our hike, we were drawn to the French city of Le Puy-en-Velay, a city that is noted in the earliest writings about the pilgrimage and that has incredible architecture and history in its own right. On a frosty April morning in 2015, Eric and I set out from that grand cathedral arch you see there on the right, and we headed west across a landscape of rich black volcanic hills. Following this trail over the next 79 days, we crossed 2 countries, 2 mountain ranges, and more than 1,000 miles. Finally, in late June, we walked into the ocean in Finisterre, Spain, which literally translates to the end of the world. In between, the country we passed was wildly and beautifully different. In France, we climbed to walk across high plains and descended steep paths into river valleys. We stayed in at least 5 towns that claimed to be the most scenic in France, and in cities famous for their rich wines and their Basque cheese. When we crossed the Pyrenees and left France behind, we were only halfway done. In Spain, we passed through Hemingway's beloved Pamplona, and we spent a week walking across the Meseta, the Great Plains of Spain. We explored tiny villages and climbed the mountains of Galicia, where the Celtic influences are still strong. We passed through cities and wild places, often in the same day. That's the story I tell in the book, But since this is a talk about hiking in Europe on a broader scale, I can't resist popping in a few pictures from this past spring when Eric and I went back and walked 17 days on the Camino del Norte, which hugs the northern coast of Spain and gives you stunning cliff and beach walking. I just want you to see an example of the diversity and beauty of a long-distance pilgrimage trail. Wherever you decide to walk, the landscape's going to change on an almost daily basis, but the magic never will.
Your idea of trail magic may be a pilgrimage like the one Beth did on the Camino de Santiago, or it may be something entirely different, but you won't know until you get a better understanding of the variety of trail experiences that are available in Europe. I devote an entire chapter to this in my book, Explore Europe on Foot, where I go in depth about the many different kinds of European trails that exist and share my favorite day hikes and medium distance routes with you. For now, I'd like to give you just a taste of 5 different types of routes that I think you'll especially enjoy. The first is a history hike. One of my favorite history hikes is King Ludwig's Way in Bavaria, which is located in southern Germany. This trail retraces the life of the Mad King Ludwig, and because there's no more fitting way to honor a Mad King than by walking a trail backwards, that's exactly what people do. They start at a votive church that marks the spot of King Ludwig's death and walk south toward his childhood home, the castle of Hohenschwangau, and his pride and joy, the castle of Neuschwanstein, the inspiration behind Walt Disney's fairy tale castle. There's so much to discover along the way. An abbey where monks have been brewing their own beer for hundreds of years, the oldest weather station in the world, and a famous pilgrimage church that was commissioned in the 1700s and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. One of my favorite culture hikes is a walk on the relatively flat Alsace wine route, which winds its way through one of France's most popular wine-growing regions and stops at a different medieval town every 3 miles. These towns are perfect places to have a glass of wine and eat a delicious pastry as you watch for the giant storks that call these towns home and admire the Mother Goose-like architecture that surrounds you. It's also the perfect place to soak in the charming Alsatian ambiance, which is a really fascinating fusion of French and German elements, since the region has repeatedly gone back and forth between the 2 countries. It's a cultural tug-of-war that you, the traveler, get to win. In Europe, you can discover the very best of nature. One of my favorite trails for this is Iceland's Laugavegir Trek, which leads you through 2 national parks and past several active volcanoes in one of the most fascinating natural landscapes in the world. The hills are shockingly green and black. The smell of sulfur is everywhere. You make sure to stay on trail because just off trail, there are steaming vents and boiling mud puddles. I've never experienced anything like it anywhere else in the world. One of my favorite parts of the Laugavegir Trek is that at night, if the conditions are right, you can step outside and see the northern lights. It's magical. Most of the trails I've shown you here are either of easy or medium difficulty, but in Europe, you can also challenge yourself with a bucket list hike that has some serious elevation gain. One of my favorite trails for that is a 4-day section of the longer Tour du Mont Blanc, which winds through France and Italy and gives hikers plenty of high alpine passes to test their mettle. This is a trail for those who love mountains, and it's one that you'll have the best time on if you train. But the views you get while hiking, snow-capped mountains and plush green valleys, are stunning and well worth the climb. You might have noticed that these trails that I've shown you are several days long, but you can get the benefits of an epic walk in just a day. One of my favorite day hikes is Omaha Beach in Normandy, France, where thousands of Allied troops landed during the D-Day invasion of 1944. This 5-mile stretch of sand couldn't be more peaceful nowadays. Kids splash in the water and seagulls soar overhead, but there's still plenty of evidence of the beach's bloody past, from German bunkers high on the cliffs to somber memorials buried in the sand. A walk on Omaha Beach is the best way I know of to get up close and personal with World War II history, and it's doable in just a day.
So you have a lot of options, right? But what is it really like on the trail? What does a day of cultural hiking in Europe look like? When I was walking the Camino, my new friends from around the world would also often ask me if we had trails like this in the United States. And I would laugh at them and point to a barn we were passing or a bridge we were crossing, like this one in Cahors, France. and explain that all of this is older than my entire country. Or I would raise my latte or glass of wine at them, depending on the time of day, and try to explain that in the US, our long trails try to avoid civilization. You have to work to get into town from the Pacific Crest Trail. In both cases, they were shocked. Why would someone go out of their way not to pass a local bar and enjoy a croissant and a coffee on their long walk? Why would someone carry a tent when they could just pay 5 or 10 euro per person for a guest house bed and shower and cut the weight of their pack in half? And how do we Americans live with so many bears and so little history? I didn't really have a good answer for them. The Europeans treat long distance walking in ways that most Americans just don't. In my experience, walking in Europe is a holiday, not a sport. It draws people of all physical levels, not just super athletes, and it gives them the chance for adventure at their own pace. You might remember me saying this is before that this is part of what drew me. I am not a risk-taking type, but this was walking, not mountaineering. Many of the people I met on the Way of St. James were celebrating their retirements. Others are taking breaks from work to walk a week or two at a time, and then they come back the next year to pick up where they left off. I've met parents pushing children in strollers and adults in their 70s, which isn't to say that this was, oh, look, croissants, I should have showed you that. Which isn't to say that this is a walk in the park. We walked an average of 15 miles a day after day, in all kinds of weather. Some people walked farther and some people walked less. There are no fixed stages of the Camino, so you can find the pace that works for you. Crossing countries means crossing a variety of terrains. We've slogged through mud and pounded pavements on quiet country roads. We dodged traffic in industrial suburbs and navigated ankle-threatening rocks on original Roman roads. I think the highest point Eric and I climbed to was a 4,500-foot pass in the Pyrenees that you can see here that was once used by Charlemagne and later Napoleon to invade Spain. There were other parts of France that I called the moguls because they were these constant climb, descent, as we crossed multiple river valleys in a day. Early in my walk, a Canadian friend explained to me, you walk, you arrive in town and you take care of your feet. You take care of your necessities. You eat, you sleep. You do it day after day and it becomes a meditation. Eric and I simplified this to walk, eat, sleep, repeat. And it became our mantra. Because long distance walking became our exercise in being present. We were carrying everything we needed, a change of clothes, an indoor sleeping bag, some basic toiletries. There were plenty of markets and pharmacies along the way if we needed to resupply. So we turned off our phones, relying on printed guidebooks and reliable trail markers instead of apps and distracting social media. And we typically passed through a couple of towns every day, so when we were hungry, we could stop in bars and cafes for coffees or sandwiches, or a slice of the egg and potato dish called tortilla patata that I came to love. Or we'd buy a day's worth of picnic supplies at the local market and eat by the side of the road, like what we were doing when this farm dog came up to say hello in France. For just a few euro, we could find ourselves with gourmet picnics of baguettes and local cheese, fruit and pâté. In the afternoons, we could stop for lattes or beers. When we reached a place that we wanted to stop for the day, we found where we would sleep for the night. Our lodgings were as varied as the landscape. There are private bed and breakfast type guest houses, government-owned hostels with dorms specifically for hikers, and everything in between, all along the Camino trails. On our limited sabbatical budget, Eric and I typically chose to stay in the hostels, which are called albergues in Spain and gîtes in France. We slept in bunk beds or twin beds with anywhere from 4 to 40 other people. But when we needed to break it up and splurge a little, there were always private rooms and private baths to be found. One of the lessons for me of being present was intentionally not trying to overthink or overplan this trip. So we didn't go into it with a day-by-day agenda of how we would get from France to the ocean in Spain, or how long exactly it would take. We rarely planned more than a day or two in advance. In France, we discovered we could call, or have someone who spoke better French than us call, a guest house to reserve a place a day in advance, especially if they offered dinner. Gîtes in France were often rural and offered what's called demi-pension, which is magic. This is where you share dinner, lodging, and breakfast. In Spain, it was always possible for us to walk into a town and find a couple of beds in one of the hostels that was there. However, I get that that style of walking doesn't work for everyone. And I want to point out that there are plenty of online services where you can book rooms in advance, baggage services that will transport your backpacks for those of you who don't want to or can't carry it, and even tour services that will schedule an entire lodging and sightseeing adventure in advance, if that's your preference. Most afternoons, we would walk for the morning, arrive early afternoon, settle and shower, and then we had plenty of time to explore whatever area we were in. There were cathedrals and museums, cities and parks, and often festivals to watch, like this one on the right in Pamplona. Then there was dinner. Private guest houses in France almost always offered dinner and breakfast for their guests, with generous three-course meals that often featured regional specialties. In Spain, we would typically find a cafe or bar that offered a menu of the day, or a pilgrim's meal, modestly priced and filling. And then we were in bed, usually by 9 or 10. If you're a pilgrim, don't count on seeing the late night nightlife of Europe. Walk, eat, sleep, repeat. But it's not really about the trail, the food, or the lodging. If you want to know what walking in Europe is really like, it's about joining in this international community. In France, our Camino family was maybe 10 or 12 people we saw almost every day. They ranged in age from 23 to 74, and they came from 5 different countries. In Spain, those numbers expanded, and so did the diversity. Eric and I shared our 14th wedding anniversary dinner with a Swiss salesman, a Mexican mother and daughter, and a Korean college student, who all happened to be in the same village in Spain that we were in, where the buildings were still made of straw and mud, and the shepherds in the fields rode horses. For me, this lifestyle was the perfect mix I was looking for. I didn't need to be some kind of super athlete or someone who enjoyed suffering in order to rely only on my body to carry me. This was walking with a backpack and a simplified lifestyle, not trying to outsport anyone. Every day on the Camino is different, beautiful in its own way, and a challenge to be fully present, because you're always moving, slow enough to make eye contact with the cows, but fast enough to see what's over the next hill.
Hopefully by now you can see yourself exploring Europe on foot. But how do you even begin planning the epic walk of a lifetime? We have 3 main tips to get you started. The first is to choose the right route. There are so many incredible experiences out there. The key is to choose the one that's right for you. So how do you go about doing that? There are a few things you should think about. The first is what lights you up. Like we talked a little bit about earlier, there are so many different kinds of trails in Europe. There are history hikes, culture hikes, nature hikes, bucket list challenge hikes, and many more. Choose whatever interests you the most. Next, you want to think about how far you're interested in walking, not just in total, but each day. You want to make sure this matches the trail you choose and that you and your travel companions are all on the same page. Something to keep in mind is that the mileage you tackle and pace you keep will be dictated by the slowest person in the group, so choose your walking partners wisely. The last thing you should think about in selecting your route is what I call my trail deal breakers. I go over these in detail and explore Europe on foot, but any trail you choose should pass this litmus test. It should have doable daily sections and sufficient services like food and accommodations en route. There should be detailed route information like walking directions, paper maps, and GPX tracks available. And the trail should be well signed. Every trail I recommend in my book meets those criteria, but if you choose a walk of your own and it doesn't pass every part of the test, you should consider choosing another trail. Once you select your trail, it's time to get trail fit. Remember, you don't need to be a super athlete to explore Europe on foot, but you will have the best time on trail if you work on your functional fitness. That means training your body for the specific challenges of hiking. There are exercises and stretches you can do to train for walking uphill, walking downhill, which is actually harder on your body than going uphill, wearing a pack, being on your feet for hours a day, and walking for several days in a row. I teach you everything you need to know in my book, bringing everything together with the training plan and even helping you troubleshoot any problem areas like creaky knees. My third and last tip for you when it comes to exploring Europe on foot is to travel light. This is one of the very best things that you can do to maximize your enjoyment on trail. Leave everything at home that doesn't need to go with you. Everything in your pack should earn its keep. That's easy if you follow my method. You can have one trail outfit, one town outfit, lots of crossover layers, and only 2 pairs of shoes, and still be covered for everything from a rainy walk to a nice dinner at a cute cafe. What's more, your backpack will weigh in at less than 20 pounds. You're going to love traveling this light, and I guarantee you're going to have a better time because of it. Whatever trail experience you choose, whether it's a pilgrimage or an alpine trek, there's so much to look forward to. Food, music, wine, people, and of course, amazing walking. Europe awaits, and it's incredible. All it takes is your feet and a good trail. Happy hiking.
And now I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Yep, and we have some ladies. So first, Darlene asks, would you be safe to do these as a solo walker?
Oh, hey, check it out. Here we are. This is Beth answering. This is a question that comes up a lot because of the numbers of people who walk the Camino. There are more than half of them are women. And a lot of them are the people I've met are women who travel by themselves, who travel solo. And maybe we'll find friends along the way, or maybe we'll experience this on their own. My answer has always been, I am safer on the trails of Europe 100% more than I am in my own home city in Seattle. It's more dangerous for me to drive to get here to talk to you tonight than it was for me to go for a walk. That's not to say there's not any petty theft. That's not to say that there's not the occasional tragic story of violent crime. But those are so rare that they're the reason. That's why we keep talking about them.
Okay, Virginia asks, do you indicate in your books which trails or sections of trail are paved, either the ones in Europe or on the Camino trails?
Yeah, so in my book, I do cover some of that information. So I talk details about the trails that I recommend. So I'll say the difficulty, I'll give you an idea of the tread of the trail, if it's dirt or if it's paved. Good example is the Alsace wine route, where I really call out that it's ADA accessible. So if you have a stroller, if you have someone who's in a wheelchair, it's a great trail for you. And then I also lay out in a different chapter exactly where you can go to find trails that are paved. So a lot of those are bike routes actually in Europe that are really great for walking. So you can find all of that information in the book.
David asks, any suggestions on walks which can be done in cooler weather, even winter?
I will say that people walk the Camino routes across Spain year round. Some of the people I know best have fantastic stories about walking in the snow. I would avoid most of the things that have high passes, but you're probably in a better place to.
Yeah, so I agree. You want to avoid anything that's a high alpine pass, but if you stick to the lowland routes, you can actually have some really great experiences in winter because you can snowshoe from hut to hut sometimes, or village to village, and that can be a totally different way to experience the trails of Europe. And there's no better way when you have Christmas markets and different things like that going on in Europe as well.
Darlene asks, how did you come up with your travel budget?
How did I come up with my travel budget? I had read a lot of online forums and conversations from people who had Camino experience, and they'd given me a general guess. And I mean, I will also say that we went in without much of an idea of what we were doing. If you read the first couple of chapters, there's a lot of learning curves and processes in there. So we had kind of a major, like we had a bucket of money, and it took us a little while to figure out, okay, France costs about this much per day. Spain costs about this much. It was a little less. Spain is cheaper than France.
Yeah, so I do a lot of research on the trails that I do before I go. So that's because sometimes I'm choosing places that are cheaper to travel intentionally. So one of those examples is Portugal. Portugal is very affordable for traveling, and I cover a trail in my book called The Fisherman's Trail, and it's on a network called the Rota Vicentina. And so before I did that trail, I really looked at, okay, how much is the lodging going to be? Because on that trail, you generally want to book in advance. And then I looked at, some websites like Lonely Planet to see what a good food budget would be. And then I always give myself a little buffer in my trail budget. And some of that buffer is actually cash that I carry, because inevitably you're going to stumble upon the vendors who are so small that they never accept card or anything. And so I always like to work some of that buffer in as well. But the key, I think, is to really do your research. And like Beth said, I mean, to some degree, you kind of just have to go out there and learn which areas are more expensive and which are cheaper, and then where you want to splurge. Some people want really nice accommodations, but they're not foodies and they don't really care about that. Other people, it can be opposite.
And that's a good point about having a little bit of a buffer, both in time and in cash on hand, because you're not always sure what's going to happen. You may find that you have a day-by-day schedule, but then you get a stomach bug and you need to spend a couple of days not in a hostel with a lot of people in bunk beds, but you need a little privacy. Or you discover, like I do, that you went with entirely the wrong shoes for a 1,000-mile hiking trip. And so you have to figure out how to buy shoes in France and pay for those.
Beth, I don't think that you mentioned how long you were on the trail, but your trip was pretty long, right? Because you started.
Yeah, we went for the full 90 days that you're allowed to be in Europe. We walked for 79 days total. So we started on April 5th, 2015, and we arrived in Finisterre on June 25th. So when you're talking about a trip that's that long, you do have a lot more space for buffers.
And you even with your sort of sketchy planning on the finances, you made it all the way to the beach?
We did. We made it all the way to the beach. We made it with money still in the bank account. It's amazing how inexpensive it really is to have a walking holiday. I know Cassandra talked about this a little bit, but our budget in Spain was 20 to 25 euro a day per person. But that includes food, all of the lodging, and we're sleeping in beds. We're taking showers every day. We're drinking fantastic wine. We're getting 3-course dinners. And we're doing it all on a budget that supported taking a 3-month sabbatical. I don't know any other trip that we could have done without having some kind of extra cash source.
It's something that we've talked about, which is that you can spend less in a day on trail than you would just going out for dinner in your own hometown here. Yeah. Which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, you would spend more for a nice dinner in the neighborhood where we are tonight than you would on a week in Spain on the Camino.
Mm-hmm.
Michael asks, does your book help with travel in Eastern Europe, Poland, Slovakia, etc.?
That's a good question.
Yeah, so I do cover a little bit of that. So I actually go into Slovenia and Croatia. Eastern Europe is a little bit tricky, and in the future I want to write an Eastern Europe specific book because there's a lot less trail information available, especially a lot less available in English. So it actually takes a lot more resources to walk there. It's a great place because a lot of spots in Eastern Europe are more undiscovered, so you won't have a lot of tourists, but you just have to know that. So it can just take a little more effort, but the reward is definitely worth it.
And where in your book where is that? You have at least one trail, right, that you
Yeah, so
outline?
there are 2 day hikes actually in Eastern Europe. One of them is in Slovenia and one of them is in Croatia.
Hmm. So Anna asks, what kind of camera phone or slash camera phone did you guys use on your trips? You both have wonderful photos.
Thanks.
Thanks. I took a little Canon PowerShot ELPH, E-L-P-H. I don't remember the numbers. It's been a little while, but it was small enough to fit just in a pants pocket. Didn't have all of the bells and whistles that a smartphone would have, but took high resolution, high digital quality pictures.
So I also walked with a Canon PowerShot, but mine was the G7X, and it took great photos. I loved it for that. But actually, I ended up taking most photos on my smartphone just because it was easier. It was in my pocket, and sometimes I just wanted to even leave the weight of my camera behind.
Kathy asked about lodging. She was wondering, is it almost always available, and is 1 day advance bookings usually okay?
I can only speak for the Camino and say that I've been back 3 times now. Yes, you can if you're making bookings 1 day in advance, that's plenty. In France, they prefer you to make a booking at least 1 day in advance. They were always a little more hesitant when we just walked into town. In Spain, in a lot of the the city-owned albergues and hostels, if that's the kind of lodging you're looking for, they don't take reservations. It's entirely first come, first serve. So guest houses, there are guest houses that you can book on booking.com, and then there are places that you can walk up to. But we never booked more than a day in advance.
So I would say for a lot of the other routes in Europe, your best bet is to research the trail, because if you're going during peak season, which is usually summer, or even a little bit in the shoulder season, if it's close enough to the peak season, sometimes you only have one guest house in town to choose from, and those rooms are booked. So if it's a popular trail, if it's a popular time of year, I definitely recommend booking in advance. The one caveat to that is that you have to be really judicious with how many miles you choose to do each day. Because if you're off and you've booked everything, you're a little bit screwed, and then you may need to take a taxi or a bus or train to kind of close that gap. I have a couple times just decided to wing it, and there was only one time when it almost didn't work out, and I had to stay in an attic room in a hotel when it didn't usually let out this attic room, but it turned into a good adventure. So I would say know that you may have to scramble. I think your best bet is usually on most trails to book in advance.
And I think it's probably good to point out at this point too that this is Europe, so there are trains and buses and cabs. Right. If you get yourself in a position where you're not sure if you're going to make it to the next town or the place where you thought you were going to be, it's a first world country, so they have better public transit than in many parts of the States. This last trip, we would just open Google Maps, the app Google Maps, and they would have all of the bus information and tell us how to get to the next place.
Yeah, so one of the skills that I cover in my book is all about calibrating your pace. And so the earlier you know if you're actually going to hit the trail at the end of the day like you're supposed to, the more options you have, right? And the safer you can be. Because you don't want to end up somewhere after dark. But in Europe, that rarely happens because of public transportation and just because how close you are to towns a lot of the time.
Okay, Katie asks, what did you do for travel insurance or health insurance, assuming you quit a job at home before you left?
We didn't, Eric, we did not quit jobs at home. We took sabbaticals, which meant that I'm self-employed, so health insurance is always a question for me. But Eric was going back to the same job that he had left. And so he maintained his health insurance through that time period. And I think I was on his insurance at that time. I go back and forth, but we kept our US health insurance and did it that way. I will say that we did not have travel insurance or additional health insurance. And I know that that is something that a lot of people do and find important. And so I just am not in the best place to answer it. What do you know? You're the expert.
So when I travel, I get an international health insurance rider, and it's really cheap. I think for a whole month, it's about $30. And so it's well worth it for me because I've actually, when I was on my flight to Iceland to hike the Lagavegr trek, I came down with a really terrible tooth infection. And so I had to go to the doctor, and it has really paid off for me to have an international plan. It's made it a lot easier. I also now do travel insurance because at one point I was hiking in Scotland and I was trying to make my way back to Paris to fly home. And my flight was just completely canceled, the hopper flight from Scotland to Paris. My flight from Paris back home was not. And so had I had travel insurance, it would have given me money. It would have replaced my flight that was canceled, and it would have really taken care of me. Instead, I had to buy a $400 last minute train ticket to Paris, which really sucked. And that was a good learning opportunity for me because it showed me the benefits of travel insurance. And so now I do use that. And in the book, I cover what makes a good policy, what companies are good and reputable, and exactly what kind of coverage you need.
Okay. Let's see. Katie also has a follow-up. She says, did you bring a tent or any gear for camping outside, or did you always plan to exclusively sleep indoors?
We always planned exclusively to sleep indoors.
Yeah, that's what I do when I travel as well.
I think the additional weight of carrying camping gear, and we did know people who did that. We've met people who carried tents and would occasionally, just for the safety and security of it, or for the possibility of wild camping. I would say that the people who were doing that on a long hike, like at least a 30-day hike, were sending that gear home within the first 2 weeks because it was too much extra weight. And there's not that many camping opportunities in Europe.
And the other difference too is that the accommodations are so cheap in Europe that there's not a huge difference like there is in the US between camping and staying, say, in a guest house or in a hotel. The spread is very small. And so if it's only just a little bit extra money, it's usually worth the comfort. And so I think most people prefer that.
Yeah, I think I said briefly in the talk, but an albergue, a municipally owned hostel in Spain, is €5 a night. And campsites that we were seeing were about the same thing. And you can often find places that are even donation based. Because this is a pilgrimage trail, there are volunteer groups from around the world and also church groups that will create hostels that you can pay as you want, pay as you can. Plus showers.
Yeah, showers.
Well, speaking of pay, John asks, Beth mentioned some vendors take only cash. Do all accommodations and restaurants take Visa?
On the Camino, everything was cash based. I mean, restaurants, lodging for the night, hostels, everything. We almost, except when in emergencies where we were checking into a hotel because we had a stomach flu or I was buying shoes, everything we did was cash based. And so you go to an ATM and you take out enough cash for a week or two at a time.
Yeah, so I would say in my experience, a lot of vendors do not take card, same as what Beth is saying. But on the trails that I've done and that I cover in my book, more of them do. So the ones that don't, say the accommodations or maybe the high alpine huts, because they don't have any Wi-Fi, they have no way to process cards. But most of the ones in town do. But it's like the bakery for under, €2, they won't take a card. Or if you're at the train station and there's a little hot dog stand or something like that.
It is a much more cash-based society in general.
Yeah.
Anna asks, is traveling in August an option? I've heard that countries shut down or take a vacation for the entire month.
So in my experience, I've done a lot of traveling in August and I've never just been out of luck. I think you need to research where you're going. And in that case, I would book stuff in advance, but August is definitely a good option, especially in areas where visitors want to be. They're going to have people working.
Yeah, I would say on the Camino, your challenge is not that things have shut down. The challenge is that everyone in Europe who is off for the month of August is also walking the Camino. And so the numbers just spike up. The holy day of St. James, the feast of St. James, is at the end of July. And so a lot of people try to get to the city of Santiago for that. And so from mid-July through the end of August are by far the busiest times as far as just other walkers being there.
Okay, and the last question we have time for this evening is from Kathy. And she says, how do you find so much time to do those long walks?
So my question would be, sometimes how do you not find the time? You know, I think how Beth mentioned, which with feeling really burned out, sometimes you really just need to take time off and do a walk like this to kind of reclaim your soul and be able to go about your life. That said, we're both in a pretty fortunate position to be self-employed. So back when I did my big grand trip, it was several months long, and I went freelance and I got to work a little bit while I was traveling. And then, you know, for my other trips, it was all research based. So it was, I knew I was writing this book and I knew that I was going to go and walk every single day. And it was fun, but it wasn't really about fun. It was about writing the book. So, but being self-employed definitely has its advantages.
I would say that if you want to do one big epic, you want to do a 3-month, that's something that you plan several years in advance for. Eric and I knew a year and a half in advance that we were going to be doing it. He went to his employer a year before we went and said, this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing. I can come back. I really love my job. I can come back afterwards, or I can not, and it's up to you. I think that one of the things you decide is, what is your priority? If this is what's important to you, we had decided we were going to do it. If we needed to come back and find a different job at the end of that, that's okay. And they were fantastic. They were very supportive. They spent a year making a plan for how he could be gone for 3 months, how he could be on sabbatical. He came back, went back to work. Everybody was super happy. And in the time since then, you know, it doesn't have to be a month trip. We went this spring for 3 weeks, and that's a normal, you know, that was our normal American vacation time. And that's what we committed to doing for this year, for that period of time.
So most of the trails that I have in the book have been cut down. I call them right-sized, because they're longer trails that I've made, just their iconic sections. So I know that most people can't go for months at a time, but most people do go to Europe for probably 2 weeks, and then the weekends that bookend those.
Yeah.
And so most all of the trails in my book fit into that. And, you know, an epic walk doesn't have to be months long. You can also get the benefits of it in a day, like we talked about. So it's not all or nothing. I mean, even if you have an existing trip to Europe, if you do a day hike while you're gone, you'll reap so many benefits. So don't think that you have to be gone for months at a time to be able to do this. You'll probably get the travel bug and want to be gone for months, but you can start out with less than that.
Well, thank you so much. I think that was really fun. And I love that you guys are doing events together, some events at least, and this one tonight in particular. Both the books really fit well together. They're both dream books. Of course, I work for a book publisher, so I am a kind of person who just buys a guidebook and dreams through that. And then I just love reading a good adventure story and getting motivation from those sorts of tales, as in Beth's book. So anyway, that's the way I feel about it. I think they're just really wonderful. And thank you, audience, for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoyed this presentation. Let's see. Explore Europe on Foot and Walking to the End of the World are available wherever books are sold, and also on our website, mountaineersbooks.org, where if you use this code, Eurotrip, EUROTRIP, you'll receive a 20% discount on either or both books. Again, the discount code is Eurotrip, but if you don't have a pencil, don't worry about it. We're going to mail you, send you an email in a couple of days with that code again, and we'll also include a recording of this presentation if perhaps you know somebody that would like to hear it or you'd like to revisit it. We also have some copies of these books to give away as prizes, and we're going to let the winners know within just the next couple of days. We hope you will join us in November for the next Mountaineers Books web series episode. Please visit mountaineersbooks.org or our Facebook page for the date and topic. I'm sure we'll have that posted before too long, before the end of the month for sure. Anyway, thanks again for sharing this presentation with us. Good night and have a great week.
Bye.
Bye.